Welcome to the Cinematologist podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and joining me down the line is Dr. Dario Linares. Hello, Dario. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Professor. How are you?
I realised as soon as I'd said it that I'd led you into that unwittingly, unconsciously.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm hoping that was unconscious and not premeditated. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt.
Thanks, man. Thanks. Yeah, as soon as I said it, I was like, oh, I haven't said that in a long time. Why have I said that? And I was like, oh, yeah, maybe there's a reason.
Well, congratulations on, both of us really. You've been made full professor. I've been made associate professor since last we were on. So that's all good news.
Yes, congratulations. Yeah, nice news.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I don't think either one of us are tied up particularly on titles beyond how they apply practically in making our jobs better, hopefully, if they do. And, we're not going to turn down the money in this age of economic crisis across the board, even for people as, relatively privileged as us. But yeah, it's nice to have been given that recognition. And let's see in the next couple of years or so how that might affect what we can do in our jobs and on the podcast, if anything at all. But anyway, nobody wants to hear about that. Let's get on with the show.
Sure, let's do it. So yeah, this is the season finale for season 17, which feels quite unbelievable, really.
Is that more than 24?
More than 24.
What I mean by that, the TV series, that's one of those that had thousands of seasons. What's the TV show that's had loads of seasons, apart from something like Coronation Street or something?
Oh, that's a good shout. Yeah, so we're into like MASH territory, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. Or
Columbo.
Oh God, what's the American politics one that I love that is just gone out of my brain now? Edit point.
The West Wing.
The West Wing. Yeah, we're in that territory, aren't we?
Yeah, we've surpassed the likes of Seinfeld and Buffy and big shows. So
yeah, well past The Wire and what have you, and The Sopranos.
Yeah, amateurs.
Anyway, we're just naming TV shows now.
But it is. It's nice to think about that as a body of work. It's like, was that 8 years now? 17 seasons. Thinking about how we've changed and hopefully grown as people and as podcasters. And it still feels fresh. It doesn't feel like, oh God, got another season coming up. It still feels something to look forward to in terms of both just the general hanging out with you, talking films, talking to other people about films, and the thinking of where next season might take us.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, one of the things for me that consciously I've thought about is how this season I've kind of stepped back from using social media, particularly Twitter, not just generally, but as a kind of structuring mechanism for the understanding of what's going on, say in cinema culture and in culture more broadly, and bringing that to the show, which I think is a good thing. Obviously, I know that you're off social media entirely, and I just found Twitter completely useless, and Instagram is not great as a sort of distribution platform for podcasting, I don't think. So what that has done is allowed, more of a discussion that we kind of come up with, or a series of themes and discussions that we've kind of come up with just according to the people we've spoken to, what's occurred to us at a particular time, what events might have been going on, or collaborations we've been doing, which is much more satisfying to me than what have people been arguing about on Twitter. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, it's been nice to sort of remember what we want the podcast to be, and almost to kind of slow down and really think about what those episodes are going to be, and to take much more confidence in it just being us as well. I particularly liked the Godland and Close episode because it was just that nothing. Yeah, they were out. They were new releases, but they were both films that were prompting us to think about things that we were interested in. So it felt like a good chance to do that. And I can definitely see more of that playing out in the future.
Without a doubt, especially in between, specific episodes where there is a sort of targeted interview or event or whatever. I think just having our conversation at the heart of episodes, I think people are interested in, or at least those I've spoken to always say that they enjoy those episodes. So that's good. Which brings us to this episode, which we wanted to do just that. And I think this came up when we were talking when you were in London. And I think we were getting onto a discussion about periods of time when we've taken away from heavy loads of film watching, for example, or trying to deal with the fact that we have to do this in our day job, and then retaining a sense of not just the podcast, but generally watching films as a pleasurable experience. And that whole question of joy, fun, pleasure, escapism is interestingly kind of interwoven with an understanding of cinema and why people enjoy the cinema, or why people go to the cinema, why people watch films. But I think it's a lot more complicated than it's often given credit for. And yeah, we thought it would be an interesting subject to try and tackle, particularly because we were both feeling at times where we were going through periods where just simply the act of watching films had become a little bit of a chore. And how do you reconcile that with the fact that it's both our jobs, but also we do this podcast, as a labor of love?
I don't know if I'd say chore in my case, but certainly, interestingly, the pleasure had gone out of it, and it had become something that was not pleasurable in any sense. It was, chore's an interesting word for it, but it doesn't quite feel right. But certainly, like that. Telling myself I had to watch all this stuff and, I had to watch it for X, Y, and Z reasons, kind of creating this narrative of why I was watching films that was just not enjoyable, and I was watching a load of stuff and not really remembering what I'd seen. The idea of pleasure, I think, is really interesting in terms of why we watch films in the first place. And when I started to think about that, I was like, wow, like, it doesn't feel like anybody's getting much pleasure from watching films these days. Like, no one's really talking about it. It's all, what did this film say? Where was its politics? What is it, what is it about? And I was like, oh yeah, actually, it's hard to remember that feeling of putting something on and just enjoying it, and I use enjoyment broadly, and we'll talk about that hopefully in terms of what that could mean, but certainly just that it was a pleasurable experience in and of itself feels quite rare, which I think is quite sad.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, though, because I sometimes feel that there are kind of two aspects to the ways that people define the pleasure in watching. And again, I do want us to unpack some of those other words that we've used. But I think there is definitely a case that as you say, there is a sort of requirement, certainly from people who consider themselves sort of film aficionados or film lovers or film fans, to be very clear about there is a narrative of why they are watching that is very clearly associated with a rationale that's connected to what the film means or what they think it means or what they want it to mean. So if that's fandom, it's like, I'm watching this because I want to be defined as the fan of that thing. And the out and out pleasure of watching it is subordinate. I mean, it must be there for fans. I mean, that's the reason why you're a fan. But it's more about the enactment of fandom than it is about, just completely disassociating yourself from any context and enjoying a pure sense of enjoyment, right? But then also, I think that alongside what you've just said there, and that way I've kind of articulated it, I think there's also a real clear sense of respite. We can talk about diversion and escapism, but I don't think it's escapism in the same way that, say, maybe it was quite obvious maybe in the 1940s that going to a big Hollywood spectacle was an escape from this thing that was going out on in the real world. And that's very clear. Do you know what I mean? But I think it's almost got to the point now where watching films, or indeed maybe even engaging with a TV show that you like, that cinema and TV have become a kind of respite, almost a sort of, well, I don't actually care what's on, but it's not the real world. You know what I mean? Whatever it is, I don't give a shit, but it's making my brain tick over. So I think that's very different, I think, from sort of really embedding yourself or being able to immerse yourself in the film world. It's almost kind of like a white noise effect, which is, again, maybe why we get so much of the kind of quote unquote content that we do, which seems to me so formulaic, and people are ready to accept it in that form much more than they seemingly ever used to.
Yeah, I don't see much, critical. I mean, there might be out there. I'm not saying it's not out there. I'm just saying that I don't see much kind of critical discussion around the pleasures of TV or film, and I've always sort of thought of escapism as not necessarily something it's escaping from, but it's something that's escaping into. Cinema has always been a space to escape into, which means that its pleasures can be kind of multitudinous, as opposed to just like, I'm just going to go to escape from. But I do think that, there's become a kind of almost, like a blanket acceptance that engagement with film at a certain level, if we're talking about mainstream Hollywood or mainstream kind of British, that it that's all it's for. It's for a distraction from, which I think obscures a lot of problems with what those films are doing or those TV shows are doing now, which they might not have been doing in the past. Like thinking about the 40s, but I think it's a nice example. 40s and 50s Hollywood. These ideas of kind of escapism, but you don't have to scratch far below the surface to see some really interesting things going on and to feel like that those films are, however outlandish or kind of fantastical or just kind of stylized, are not connected to sort of real world ideas. I don't know of many films that are really escapist that don't have some kind of connectivity in that way. Although I think now that, there's a case to be made that is so. I think the other thing as well is it seems like a lot of the pleasure of being a fan comes from positioning yourself. It doesn't come from the thing itself. There's a defense of the thing, but again, it's like, well, there's no pleasure in being critical, as in, what did you like? What didn't you like? There's such a kind of sort of weight of positionality that kind of obscures whether the thing is even pleasurable in the first place. It's certainly mainstream blockbuster franchise movies, apart from one we might talk about later, with an installment coming out this year, just don't feel like fun. And it's not just what I struggle with. Is not just that I'm not having fun, but I struggle with a lot of stuff to locate where the pleasure could be found, because it feels so dour and dark and serious and expositional in terms of its politics. And I'm just like, where's the fun?
That's where I think that sense of a different type of escapism is occurring now, because you can't escape out of the ideological narratives in the real world, whether it's to do with race, gender, sexuality, and all of these kinds of things. And maybe you shouldn't be able to, and maybe that's a right-wing critique that is problematic for someone like myself to make, to be, to sort of say, there is a sort of expectation that you are going to be confronted with a series of political ideas or narratives or critiques within a mainstream film that is parallel to what we have to discuss in the real world. So therefore, the films are not designed as escapist in the same way that perhaps they weren't in the past. And maybe that's actually a good thing, or at least an acknowledgement that films can't exist with the same sort of stereotypical representations or expectations that they've had in the past, which is good. Yeah, I think I agree with you that there is often very little out-and-out joy to be had.
And if you take a film like Creed, where you can have that discussion about how it reframes film history and representation, how it brings previously sort of sidelined, marginalized narratives into the center, and how it kind of moves the conversation on in terms of race and sort of racial representations in sports movies. You can have all that conversation, and that's great. But you can also just talk about how really pleasurable it is. And people did. That was one of the great things about Creed, was the ability to, well, not the ability to, because the ability is always there, but a willingness to say, oh, this is a really interesting movie, but also, isn't Michael B. Jordan a superstar? And isn't it just absolutely rollickingly well made? And that feels, even in the time that Creed's been running up 3 installments, to have dropped off. It's like that the pleasure conversation, I think, if it stands next to the other conversation, the political conversation with a small p, if we call it that, that's kind of cinema at its best, is when it's doing that in a big way, in a huge, on the biggest canvas, with the most money, for the most people, doing 2 things at once. And that balance I know is really hard and has historically been really hard to find. And it's not about saying, well, I'm certainly not saying like I don't want my entertainment to have ideas that are not just aesthetic, but I enjoy being able to do that, being able to say, oh, look what's happening here. There's all this happening at once. And I'm drawn back to thinking about Creed a lot because the experience of watching it was so pleasurable. It didn't feel like a political agenda movie where it's like, well, we're going to do what they should have done 30 years ago. It was like, oh, here's an interesting opportunity. And also, everyone loves a really good boxing movie narrative with these characters. So it did a lot of work, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, it was funny because I was wondering what films you would sort of raise, and I remember you really, really liking that film, and not, and you said at the time, I think that you're not a Rocky stalwart, let's put it that way, which I probably more am than you know what I mean, in some ways, which is interesting. But yeah, it's. I mean, one of the things maybe we'll come on to a little bit later, though, is the question of how difficult it is now to have fun and enjoyment in films that are older, and in your heart of hearts are going to be criticized for their representations and stuff like that. And maybe we'll come on to that, when we talk about some ideas for films for people to watch later on. But I think that's one of the things that I think sucks the joy out of, not for me, the pleasure, because now, again, linking back to social media, it's that sense of I'm not going to not enjoy something that I know I can enjoy and still have at the same time in another part of my brain that there are problematic things about it, and have those two opinions that I can hold at the same time, because I'm not going to go onto social media and say, oh, I loved X, because you might get a load of shit back, because it doesn't matter. I'm having the pleasure, so who cares? But I think what's interesting, just to set this up a little bit, I read this piece called Serious Pleasures, Cinematic Pleasure, and the Notion of Fun by R.L. Rutsky and Justin Wyatt. I found this really interesting because, I mean, it's an academic piece that goes back to the very framework of how we understand the notion of pleasure. And I thought it really set up some of these ideas around joy and fun and pleasure and escapism as concepts that are related to each other, but not exactly the same. Right at the beginning, it gives a really good sort of précis of how this has been actually quite a difficult subject to tackle for academic film criticism. So just as a quick quote, they say at the beginning, if academic film criticism has always been serious about its own pleasures, it has also had a certain difficulty in theorizing a pleasure that was not serious, right? So it automatically sort of points to this idea that there are acceptable forms of pleasure within academic criticism, right? So they continue, for pleasure to enter into academic discourse, it was necessary for it to be transformed into a topic appropriate to academia, i.e., it had to be made serious. Indeed, within academic film theory, the very use of the term pleasure has served to promote this seriousness. It is significant that film theory speaks of a discourse of pleasure as opposed to a discourse of, say, for instance, distraction, entertainment, or fun. So they go on then in the rest of the piece to suggest that any pleasure that's defined as non-serious automatically gets seen as less than, as decadent, or even morally bankrupt. And I don't think that they're saying that's the way it should be. They're just pointing that out as a kind of trend in film theory. So what's interesting to me then is that as we're academic scholars, and I feel this in some ways, you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, where on the one hand, you can't abandon yourself totally to unadulterated pleasure without retaining some sense of its critical value. Because if you do that, you're putting yourself in the position of being uncontrolled in terms of your understanding of what the film represents. And you move into hierarchies of good and bad pleasures and how that's parallel to good and bad films, if that makes sense.
Kind of, yeah. So you're saying, like, in sort of very layman's terms, you find it hard. People sort of say you find it hard to switch your brain off. So you feel like you always have to kind of be engaging the critical in any scenario.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny because at the start of an academic year, you always have that feeling with the students that you're, over the next 6 months, you are going to turn these students who have this innocent pleasure of watching films into critics and kind of sucking some of that joy out of them so that they can aspire to have an objective critical perspective, let's say, or they have the criteria to look at films in that way. So therefore, on the one hand, the question then becomes, can I enjoy films totally without that anymore? And B, do I want to really? Do I actually want to be able to, and I hate this phrase, leave your brain at the door? Because I find that I find that I can't do that. And when I try to do that, it just creeps back in and I get annoyed.
But I think if you're actually watching a film, it's impossible to leave your brain at the door. I think pleasure is absolutely linked to your processing of it at that moment, that your brain is sort of saying, I'm enjoying this. And I think your brain is kind of acknowledging why it's enjoying it based on a set of things which are often really well crafted, well made, intelligent, thoughtful, clever things that are happening in the most base terms, in something like Mission Impossible. Is like there's a craft at play. There's a craft at play which I think your brain registers, and I think that's, or there's a level of comedy writing and a good comedy or just a regular comedy. I think a lot of the time, I don't like that phrase. I used it in terms of like what comes up a lot, because I think that I don't see how you do it. Like, I think when you're enjoying something, your brain is in play because your brain is acknowledging why, processing huge amount of factors into, I like this, and that might be the only level that it goes to, but it's still happening.
In the piece that they're writing, so this kind of response to what you're just saying there comes from my reading of this piece, which says that all of those things that you've highlighted there are rationalized criteria that you've learnt to understand and create and then process when you're watching. Isn't there something intangible in the pure sense of innocent pleasure that goes beyond all of those criteria? Like, say, for example, to take the example that you used there, why is it pleasurable to watch Tom Cruise throw himself out of helicopters? To the point of, there's a great craft in the way that that's been produced and it's exciting and all those kind of things. But there's something about him doing it and not somebody else, and the level of action that reaches beyond the mere rational notion of construction into something kind of intangible. Or that would be a way out of thinking about something that's not just leaving your brain at the door, but goes deeper than just intellectualizing everything.
But doesn't it connect you to when you did engage with things innocently? Isn't it part of an ongoing cultural museum that exists inside you? Like going back to those early moments of childhood of watching those, seeing certain things on screen and having a very instinctual reaction to it and almost kind of going into something, and it taps into that straight away. So for me, I would say that nothing that we do past the age of 10, 5 can happen in a vacuum. Like, the idea that we can ever watch a film innocently if we're watching it in a cinema on our own seems kind of absurd, because we are the product of by that point, when you first go to the cinema 13 on your own or whatever, when I did, maybe younger, like there's a huge amount of factors that are impacting, but there's something of the thrill of watching certain movies, which does take me back to a very, very early, my very early formative experiences. And some of them are very comforting and innocent. The films I watched with my dad, or the films I watched as a kid that really sort of stuck with me. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I suppose, again, without being all sort of mindful and zen about it, does cinema still have the ability, or when are those moments when it does produce a sense of losing of the self? And I admit it's incredibly rare when you get past a certain age, and particularly when you get to people as grizzled as us, being able to completely lose yourself, where you do kind of forget who you're with in the cinema, or who, and the context of this film, because it seems to just live on its own as an artifact, as a thing that's being injected into your brain. I don't know whether that's even possible, but I just think it's interesting that they say, that whenever then we try to think through that beyond kind of feeling it, and it's weird because I feel like me and you are swapping roles here, because you're much more one who talks in those terms usually about, I feel like this is this way and stuff. But it's interesting, guys, like another quote, they say that the pleasures that do not serve a rational truth, that have no purpose, can only be conceived by academic discourse as either trivial diversions or treacherous seduction. So in a way, they're agreeing with what your first argument is, that it's difficult to see anything outside of something that can be taxonomized or has a criteria of why it's pleasurable. And if when you do that, it's just throwing your brain to the side, or as you say there, almost kind of like, oh, I want to go back to being a kid when I had no sort of intellectual capacity beyond what was immediately kind of pleasurable to me or joyful to me.
Well, I'm just using that as an example of one way of thinking about it. I'm not necessarily saying it is possible or not. I don't know the piece, and I haven't really. What I was trying to sort of get at was like, that I think the idea that you can ever do that, I think is one I'm interested in. Like, because I think that your brain is always doing something when you're watching a film. If you're telling it it's good or bad, there's a billion reasons why it's doing that, or if you're enjoying it or not, it's doing it. But they're not always conscious, and they're not always things that. I'm sort of trying to see it as a kind of almost like an automatic thing of like, okay, I feel safe here. I feel safe in terms of like why I'm here, what I'm seeing, what's going to play out in terms of the type of experience that lies ahead. The other thing that's always makes me think is like, where does experimental cinema sit in this, in terms of where the only thing that really a lot of the time you can rely on is how you feel about something. Like the Man Ray abstract shorts we saw the other week in London, with the Squirrel live score. Like, they're really abstract works, and people do and write very eloquently and interestingly about that. But I can't do that. All I've got is, I'm here now. How do I feel about what I'm seeing and hearing? So, and that's that I don't feel capable of doing any kind of intellectualizing in that moment. So I give into it. It's kind of like, well, I'm not going to sit here and think about, what's Man Ray trying to say with these squares? I'm just like, how do I feel about what I'm seeing? So I wonder where that fits in. I mean, obviously, it's not narrative in that sense.
No, and also I think what's funny about that is that I think that it's a tricky one, because that could easily be co-opted back into the serious pleasure versus hedonistic pleasure dichotomy. Because I could sit in that with you and sort of say, that was really pleasurable in a serious way, rather than I've sort of just given myself over to the abstraction of it, which I could say that too, to be honest. But again, I think that the way they get around it, just to round off this article, the way they get around it is to separate out, in the article, is to separate out fun from pleasure, and sort of say that fun is something that cannot be co-opted into any kind of pre-prescribed system of analysis or critical thinking in that way, because you never want to try and do that. So I was thinking, like, maybe, for example, if you were watching an animation with your daughter or something like that, you might enjoy the absolute fun that gives you to experience it through somebody else's eyes, especially through your daughter's eyes.
Dad.
Yeah, hang on. Sorry, Miles has he's just come in.
And there's no way, I would argue, there's no way that you're thinking about how that is fun, or how it can be co-opted into a system of thought about its relative pleasures and merits. You know what I mean? It just is. And it's almost kind of like the flow state, isn't it? And that's what I'd compare it to. If something that I'm doing, like, for example, playing tennis or something like that, is you're in a state where the absolute practice is so fundamentally enjoyable for its own sake, with no outcomes beyond the immediacy of what it's doing, that's the sort of definition of fun, and those things can't be co-opted unless you end up doing that for other reasons, for ulterior reasons.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. I mean, it is interesting, like watching, like when I took Tessa to see our first film, which was Paw Patrol Ready Race Rescue, which is basically an extended episode of Paw Patrol. And I was aware that this was a bad thing. Like, or not, that's unfair. I just thought I don't know I don't know the words to describe it. Like, it's aimed at a very young audience. I guess what I mean by that is I'm watching it thinking, oh, there's more that could be done here, and it feels just like it's just kind of, it's a rote thing, which is fine. But then I looked across at Tessa, and she was having the best time, and I was able to enjoy it in terms of that, even if the thing I was watching was not very enjoyable to me in any sense. Like, it was hard for me to locate any kind of enjoyment in it as a thing on its own, and obviously I wouldn't have watched it without being there with Tessa. I would. But then when I went to watch Paw Patrol the movie, that was really interesting because I was able to compare it to the extended episode and find in it moments where, and the same with Sing 2, where it's like, actually, because I'm watching it seeking, I'm enjoying the experience of being with Tessa. She loves it. She's watching it very differently to me. But like, I was able to be like, oh, actually, there's things in here that are connecting to me, that are fun and pleasurable. I think, there's some really funny lines, or there's some nice moments of storytelling. So I think that is possible, but then I think that's just because I'm someone who kind of has those kinds of conversations, I guess. The other thing I'll say as well, like, I think one of the huge shifts for me in the last year has been an ability to refine fun and pleasure in films, because I'm under no pressure that I've only ever inflicted on myself to talk about them or tell anyone what I'm watching. I don't care what I watch now in terms of like obviously if we're watching something for the podcast, that's different, and if I'm writing about something, that's different. But I'm always trying to have pleasure in that as well. But like, I don't tell anyone what I watch. I mean, I put it on Letterboxd just as a kind of record for me of what I watch, but I'm not sharing it with anyone. I'm not messaging anyone. I'm not putting it out into the world. Like, there's no reason for me to watch this stuff other than what I define as my own sort of pleasure and fun. And that's really shifted how I've been able to make decisions about what I want to watch and how I feel about stuff. And even with the Man Ray stuff, I'm like, I don't know if will we ever mention this? But it's nice if we do, but it certainly it doesn't drive it. Like, and that drove a lot for me for a long time, was like feeling the need to have seen certain things and have an opinion on them ready to go. And I just don't feel that way now. I'm just like, what do I want to watch? And then the process is always kind of driven by pleasure. But there are byproducts which are, kind of what might be termed kind of academic pleasures, in terms of using it for teaching, thinking about writing about it, thinking about talking about it. They sort of swirl around in it. Not putting that front and center is definitely, and what it's also helped me try and bring joy to my students. Like, one of the things I really realize is they take it so seriously. They come in, and because they absolutely equate what they study with their long-term career, job, life, it's so serious. They don't really enjoy watching films. They don't know how to enjoy watching films. They feel guilty if they enjoy watching films because it has to have an instrumental value tied to their career. And that's sad. So one of the things I have done this year is try and share my joy at movies with my students and try and get them to feel joy, and that it's actually okay to just watch movies and feel really good for whatever reason. But that's fine. And trust that if the film is of a certain level of craft, say, to be really kind of general, the other things are going to hit you, because if you're open to it, if you're an open human being, the art, this is going to sound really pretentious, maybe the most wanking pretentious thing I've said so far, the film is going to communicate with you, and you're going to feel it, and then you're going to be able to think about it, and all this stuff is wonderful and swirling. But if you go in being like, I need to extract from this thing, that just feels like a bad place to start.
I mean, I was thinking about the fact that we come at this from a very specific perspective, and it'd be really interesting. I'm sure there's probably data out there and some qualitative research on how cinema goers who go just, now and again. It's funny. I think one of the underserved audiences in terms of understanding where cinema is, sort of, in the media landscape, let's say, or the artistic, cultural, entertainment landscape, is what about those people who literally say on a Wednesday or a Thursday, should we go to the cinema this weekend? We haven't done it for ages. Let's just open the get on I nearly said open the paper, open a magazine. It's like, let's have a more up-to-date reference. They would get on Google and they would say what's on at the local multiplex. and what drives those choices, because we engage with people who are either serious in that sense, or they're motivated by their fandom, which is that in some cases then they're even more serious to the obsessed sense, right? Or we're very much part of a kind of, the art house critical crowd who are like, have you seen the latest Mia Hansen Love or whatever? So we're coming from a very specific place, and I think that that audience position would be very different. So I can't speak to what that discourse is among that type of audience. But I think that's just as valid as any position that we would take in terms of what gives pleasure, maybe even more so, if you're talking about, because there's more of those kinds of people in the world than there is of us, that's for sure. But then the other thing, I think, just sort of reacting to what you said there, I think that we're all, to some degree, completely bombarded by the amount of culture that's out there. So there is this sort of simmering, underlying latent guilt that we all feel that we haven't seen this or we haven't seen that. And it's not just cinema, it's television, it's music, it's everything. And my answer to that is to kind of block off some areas of culture and just say, I'm just not interested. I'm not going to engage at all because, I've got enough to deal with as it is with film, as it were. But then there's the consumerist completism that we're all invited to partake in. But then also the secondary aspect of that, which is to just comment on it constantly. And that's a little bit about what you're talking about. And that leads to that sort of anxiety of, it's almost like hyper Bourdieu, isn't it? That habitus is so powerful now that to define yourself at all times, to any given position, any in relation to any film or any opinion about any film, it's almost as if it's sacrilege to be able to say, yeah, I saw it, haven't really got much to say, kind of enjoyed it or enjoyed it a lot, but nothing more than that. That's not what people are ready to hear in this culture.
No, you can't say you enjoyed it without also having to list all the reasons why it might be problematic. Like, it's become an all-consuming thing. Like, either you enjoyed it 100% or you didn't. You can't. You can't say you enjoyed it if you think that this thing's wrong with it. And that's just never a position I've really held. It's interesting, yeah. Like that idea of like what is kind of pleasurable and fun for people who don't kind of spend their lives thinking about this stuff, and which we do in a variety of different ways, be it through work or through the podcast or just through sort of critical existence. I'd be interested to see whether any of these things that we sort of think are detectable in terms of shifts in what is pleasurable on the screen for people bears any relation to how people actually would define it if kind of pressed about it. I feel much more, much closer to that kind of process of choosing than I did before, where I was definitely driven by, the idea of having to have an opinion on something ready to go, which is just exhausting, and it cannot be maintained, and that's massively what contributed to my loss of fun and pleasure in it. And I think what's interesting, just to kind of to pull it back, is like, what was lost in that was an ability to enjoy being critical and to be appreciative in a scholarly or academic way of what I'm watching, to be able to kind of go, like, I like that for these reasons. Be that, there was a lovely film I watched last night, I had just, it was a good movie and I was really enjoying the performances because I love the performers. And then right at the end, there was just this moment where I was like, oh, this is kind of why you could sort of see why the director wanted to make the film. Kind of for one shot, like this was the shot that they had when they decided to take on this picture, kind of thing, and that was really pleasing, and just it was a really great cinematic moment. And I was like, I just think I might have missed that because I'm not looking for that. I wasn't looking for that, I was looking for the things I would say about it from a certain perspective, and I kind of regret that massively. But I'm also pleased that now it doesn't define what I look for when I go to watch a film.
Yeah. It's funny there you were talking about choices for a second, because that was an interesting thing that came up just last night when I decided I wanted to do some more homework for this episode. So I said to my other half, look, let's go see something that, probably neither of us would just go out of our way to see. And I actually had it in mind to go and see the Jennifer Lawrence film, No Hard Feelings, because I've seen that it's a rom-com, right? So, and I haven't seen a rom-com at the cinema for God knows how long. And, I always think Jennifer Lawrence is watchable. She's exec produced it, but yeah, I've also seen it's been slated in certain corners, and I would have no expectations of it, right? And my other half basically vetoed that, said, I'm not going to go watch that. And that was fine. And it's interesting how it's kind of like there's an immediate perception of, I'm not going to like this for whatever those reasons are. But what was also on was Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Now, back in the 80s, I would have gone to have seen all of the Indiana Jones. The first three, I definitely saw at the cinema. I don't think I saw the last one, which I can't remember the name of now because it was so forgettable, at the cinema. Crystal Skull, that's it, right? And I just thought, okay, yeah, no, that's a good idea. Let's go and see that. But it's interesting how those two films came up on my register as these are things that I can maybe equate to a certain type of pleasure, which is non-academic or non-intellectualized. And can I just enjoy it for what it is? That was my sort of brief to myself. Just enjoy it for what it is. And I have to say, I really did enjoy Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny for the first 2/3 at least. I think James Mangold has done a really good job of turning it into a romp of set piece to set piece, but with a character that connects it together who you kind of believe in, and an actor who can play that, who knows who that character is and what that character should be doing. And there was, a lot of really nice touches. I thought Phoebe Waller-Bridge was great. Really, it's a great role for her. She gets to do all of the things that Indy gets to do. And there's no weird sexualization going on or anything like that. So, and there's no over, politics around anything to do with it. In fact, I think there are sort of nods to her character, Fleabag kind of character in some ways. When my fun and my joy of it all, which I did have, I was like, oh, this is really great. I mean, Mads Mikkelsen plays the villain, and he's just wonderful. The de-aging that takes place is kind of 95% of the way there. It's not quite perfect, but, you're not taken out of it too much. But it does that thing which I think a lot of these blockbusters do, in that the final third is where it falls down. And it's preposterous throughout, completely preposterous. But it goes to a place where there's a sense of integrity in the first 2/3 where the dream logic is kind of coherent. And even though it's ridiculous, you can still buy it. Whereas at the end, this literally kind of falls apart in terms of time and space, right? But for what it is, I really did enjoy sort of being in the company of that character and it referencing back to the older films, which I really enjoyed. But, just sort of thinking about it on the outside, I'm probably, if I'd never seen an Indiana Jones movie before and didn't have that nostalgia for it, I probably would have enjoyed it a lot less. So there are conditions already attached, I think, to my joy, even though, as I said, I kind of went in with this, I am going to enjoy it for what it is. I know it's not going to give me this message. And I was ready for that in a sense.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, in terms of like the conditions of enjoyment, kind of goes back to what I was sort of trying to get to earlier on. Like, we're as people, we're like rolling stones and we gather this moss, which is why all of this, I think it's interesting in terms of like something like Blade Runner 2049, like who is this for? No one watched Blade Runner at the cinema when it came out.
Yeah.
And then everyone who picked it up was of a certain age. It's not big in the culture in terms of like images from it are and ideas from it are, but they're not traceable back. So who is it for? Well, it's for older white men with a disposable income, really, who generationally spend too much time in a nostalgic bubble as a whole. But it is reliant on kind of tapping into things which you have accrued in terms of your viewing habits and the things that you like. That's, your pleasure is conditional on certain things. And I find that really interesting because similarly, when I was, after you said, I'm doing some homework and I was like, okay, I'll watch something tonight and I'll try, and like what I really thought, and again, kind of thought about, well, when I just want to watch something for pleasure, what am I drawn to? Well, often I'm drawn to who's in it more than anything else, like actors. And then I thought, okay, who's an actor I really like, that when I could watch them in anything. And I thought of Robert Ryan. And then I love Robert Ryan. And then I was like, well, I'll see if there's any films on YouTube that I haven't seen. And there was a kind of 76-minute potboiler with Robert Ryan and Ida Lupino called, what was it called? Beware My Lovely. And I'd never seen it. And yeah, I was like, okay. And it was conditional on the fact that, I think it was a very average movie. Neither of their, not going to be ranked along the films. But I got such pleasure from watching him and Ida Lupino, great actors doing, as they always did, really, sterling work. And those were the conditions that I wanted. I wanted to watch actors I love watching. That's a kind of gateway, which I think is interesting in terms of like when we choose these things, and the choices, like you say, might not be necessarily be conscious or things that we really, although last night it was for me because I was thinking about this episode in particular. And it was a really enjoyable movie, but I was also going, this is a bit creaky. I've never heard of this director, Henry Horner. And then I'm thinking about the other films that Robert Ryan's made with directors like Nicholas Ray, Fritz Lang. And I'm thinking, yeah, you can just feel the difference here. This is someone who's not got that thing that those filmmakers had. But then, like I said, there's the ending is brilliant. And there's one shot where you're just like, oh, okay, yeah, this was a moment. And it was really lovely to spend time with that moment and sort of almost feel like this is him being a filmmaker but yeah, I like it. I like that idea of thinking about the conditions that are present in that kind of enjoyment and those choices. I find that really interesting.
That's really, really interesting that you the kind of pleasure that you got out of that. And I think it leads us on to what we're going to do in a minute is give a few ideas of some films that you might want to watch over the summer while we're off on our break to gain some pleasure. But just a couple of things on that. I think there's two things that come out of what you were saying there about both of our sort of choices. And one of them for me was I was thinking about how the idea of unironic pleasure is kind of passé because of the kind of postmodern cinema that we've been used to in the last sort of 20, 30 years. So that idea that a filmmaker goes out to make an uninhibitedly joyful film without calling to attention the fact that they're doing that is very rare in adult cinema, I think, today. And the other thing I think is that there is almost a sneering attitude towards the idea of rewatching. And I mean this from sort of academic circles, that sense of you would throw something on that you've seen 100 times and you throw it on for the 101st time. I think sometimes gets read as, oh, you are ideologically fixed in your position. You don't want change. You don't want revolution. You want the status quo. And I think, again, that sometimes gets equated with that. A lot of people are up for smashing the canon for various very credible political reasons. And the idea that there are guys of a certain age like us putting on Taxi Driver again is seen as inherently against that, even if it's unconscious,
Yeah. That's interesting. That's certainly a feeling that is present in terms of like the choices that you make in terms of things you watch, and it drives pleasure underground as well. Like you said that about your kind of sight and sound list. You want to feel comfortable and happy with the choices that you've made, that they reflect you, and you don't want to feel bad about it. And often, there is a kind of, and Paul Schrader talked about this, the kind of performativity of the list to show that you're on the right side of things, rather than actually what do I like, and and there are myriad reasons why we like what we like, including access and the culture that we grow up in and all that kind of stuff. They play a huge role, particularly in the stuff that sticks and becomes those things that we continue to draw pleasure from. And I think it's fine to acknowledge that. And the other thing, as I think as well, it's absolutism, isn't it? It's like if you rewatch that for the 100th time, that means you must only ever rewatch the same 5 films, which is not true. It just means that in certain scenarios, at certain times of my life, I'm going to go back to these things because they're pleasurable. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to watch a Bergman movie or a Varda movie. It just means that right now, what I really want to watch is, in my case, Mean Streets, if it's Scorsese.
Yeah, of course. So do you want to go through a few films then that we recommend? So you can take any of these as films to throw on over the summer if you really just want to have a good time. What I've done, Neil, is I've got a few things that I want to go down on a list, but I started off by trying to think of the film that I would throw on, and if there was no other film available, and this is ultimate pleasure. And that's the only film I've got left to watch for the rest of my life. And I just love it to death. And the one film that I came up with above all others in that category was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. That is probably my ultimate fun film.
Interesting. Good choice. Mine literally just popped into my head like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Was The Big Lebowski.
Wow.
I think that would be the film that I just love it so much, and I rewatched it recently, and I was just like, I had so much fun, and I'm like, this is a joyful experience. Everything about it is joyful. So that would be my one for that criteria in terms of like what just literally jumped in. So maybe I'll do a couple, and then you do a couple. We just bat it backwards and forwards. So everyone should watch Pacific Rim. I think we probably accrued a number of listeners since we had our Pacific Rim tete-a-tete way back. So this is just a kind of biannual reminder that I love Pacific Rim, and I think it's great fun. And can
I just say that I did rewatch that and gave it more credit the second time around, if you remember.
I know, because it's a well-made fun movie with massive flaws. So the films that kind of came to mind were kind of lots of different things. We sort of mentioned Creed, but the basically based around sort of crime and pulp. So 2 Robert Ryan movies, Day of the Outlaw and Odds Against Tomorrow. I would absolutely heartily recommend, and there's great Blu-rays of both of those around. And before I go over to you, I get a lot of pleasure from watching concert films, obviously. So if you haven't seen Talking Heads Stop Making Sense, then you should rectify that. That'll be a really good time. Jonathan Demme's concert film. So I've got some more. What about you?
Well, I sort of bunched. It's very hard to do one, isn't it? But I sort of bunched them into kind of different types of joys and pleasures, a little bit like you've done there. Just to start off with big action, I would heartily recommend watching, in preparation for Dead Reckoning Part 1, I highly recommend watching Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, not Fallout. You can watch Fallout as well, but Rogue Nation is still better than Fallout, and that's just the truth. But it's obvious that when it comes to franchise movies or big budget action, I like the films that are set in some semblance of the modernist reality, right? And I watched the documentary, the Arnold Schwarzenegger documentary on Netflix, and after that I went back and revisited True Lies, and that is a great action film. If you haven't seen Arnold Schwarzenegger essentially doing James Bond with Jamie Lee Curtis as his unsuspecting wife, a little bit Mr. and Mrs. Smith style, then you should go back and watch Peak Arnie in True Lies.
Good shouts. I'm also going to recommend. I've been trying to watch this double bill since we saw. Well, for the last month or so, and I write about it in the newsletter. But a double bill of Jim Jarmusch's Down by Law, followed by Ghost Dog, Way of the Samurai. I think that's going to be a really pleasurable double bill when I get round to that this summer. So we should all watch that double bill at some point. And I still want to do a proper Jarmusch deep dive at some point. And then spend time with a couple of films that inspired Jarmusch, maybe something by Seijun Suzuki or Jean-Pierre Melville, I would recommend. And of those, Le Samurai and Branded to Kill, I would say. And I got one more, but what about you? Oh, actually, no, sorry. And just before...
go for it.
Joe Dante marathon, Burbs, Matinee, Gremlins.
Great. Yeah, well, I've got a Jarmusch. I'll just come to that in a second. But my next category is kind of like the 80s, 90s high production values drama. And I think that is one of the it's the kind of movies you don't see very much anymore. I'm thinking probably the closest one, the one that I would throw on all the time that's very recent is probably Moneyball. And the Big Short is probably in that category as well. But I think there are some from the 80s and 90s that are so good. Like, say, for example, A Few Good Men. If you haven't seen that in a while, I'm talking big names. The money is on the screen. It's well written and well directed. So A Few Good Men. Training Day. I can watch Denzel in anything. Go back and watch that. Nightcrawler with Jake Gyllenhaal, and I love Jake Gyllenhaal being Psycho. That's my favorite Gyllenhaal, performance. And I actually sort of caught again the end of Thelma and Louise because it just happened to be on one of the streaming channels, and that's just wonderful. It's just so good. And all of these movies, I think, are the types of movies you don't see so much anymore. And then my second to last category was films that are very emotionally wrought, but I have a very kind of highbrow kind of aesthetic. So if you haven't seen it, I know a lot of people are talking about One Fine Morning and Bergman Island, but go back and see All Is Forgiven by Mia Hansen-Løve and Prepare to be Destroyed. I would also recommend Cold War, Pavel Pawlikowski, one of my favorite movies of the last few years. And my Jarmusch recommendation would be, of course, Patterson, which I rewatched again recently. And it's just a beautiful film. It really is.
Yeah, nice. Weirdly, a film popped into my head, and I think it's because you mentioned Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, and then you mentioned 90s kind of high quality drama, and that's Quiz Show, which I haven't seen in a long time, but I would really like to rewatch Quiz Show. So I might rewatch Quiz Show because I remember that being just like, this is a great movie. I wonder how when it's held up. Yeah. So my finals or two recommendations kind of fall under those pleasures that kind of encompass the pleasure of a number of things like craft. I listened to the Pod Thomas Anderson series of podcasts, which is quite interesting. But one of the things that sort of came up a lot, particularly in his early films, was like people criticizing him for showing off and like being too movie. At the age I am now, I think I'm just like, I want to see people making movies and having fun with the form. The idea of showing off to me is like, yeah, just I'm watching a film, remind me I'm watching a film kind of thing a lot of the time. Having that fun in the craft, virtuosity, and dialogue as well. So, obviously he's great for that. And any Billy Wilder film really is great for that. But the last choice would be Inherent Vice, because it gives me the pleasure of looking at a beautiful, people say it looks dingy, but I just love that it's aesthetic. I think it's aesthetically, but also, stand up for the idea that melancholy and can be fun, like it's okay to be sad and to enjoy being sad. And the idea of like listening to sad songs and finding pleasure in it, that for me is just it's a great big sad song of a film. And I just love it. And I think it's beautiful and it sounds great. It looks great. It's got great performances. And it weirdly just leaves me feeling good, even though it's a sad movie,
Yeah, brilliant. So my last category is out and out comedies, which I know we had a long discussion about that. And I'm much more of somebody who generally likes comedy performances within drama movies when they work really well. But just two out and out comedies I would recommend. The first one is Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. And I just think that Steve Martin, and both of these films I'm going to recommend are kind of buddy movies. And I just think that Steve Martin in the scene where he's playing Ruprecht is so politically incorrect and so funny. It will literally either, when you watch this, you either think, oh my God, Dario, I never want to speak to you again, or that is really funny. You know what I mean? It's just great. And I like it because it's set in this kind of, on the make, confidence tricksters, and one of them's that Michael Caine plays the master of this, and he's trying to train the very much down at heel Steve Martin, and it's just great how amazing funny scenes all the way through. And the other movie that I want to recommend is The Hard Way, which I know we talked about in the past, I think, and we were on about screening this at one point, but I think with Michael J. Fox, Michael J. Fox with his documentary coming out. And I think it would be really easy to say, I recommend Back to the Future, as a fun time, because it definitely is a fun time. But I think, with that documentary, you have to be reminded of what a great comedy actor Michael J. Fox really is, and what a great career he had around Back to the Future on television and in the cinema. And in this movie, he kind of plays a version of himself who wants to land a role in a grizzled cop movie. So he's sick of being a comedian in Hollywood and wants to become a seriously taken actor. So he ends up doing research alongside James Woods, who plays this super tough New York cop. So it's the kind of throwing together of these two personalities. And there's just some amazing scenes of James Woods just getting absolutely annoyed and irritated by having little Michael J. Fox wanting to know how to be the best cop in the world kind of thing. And it's just, it's really, really worth it. Great fun.
And now James Woods has made a career out of just being annoyed by everything all the time.
But we can keep those two things in our head at the same time, as we've just discussed.
Absolutely. I will watch Videodrome any day of the week. That's a great show. Sure. I think we have talked about The Hard Way and screening it, so I think I'm going to rewatch that. That's my summer homework. And Dirty Rotten Scoundrels is amazing. I love that movie so much. So that's a great shout. Yeah, lovely list of stuff to spend some pleasurable time with.
Great. Well, Neil, lovely to do another season with you. It's been a pleasure. It's been a joy. All of those things, and yeah, obviously great to have you back after your break and be sort of back in the saddle, as it were. And obviously, I think that the discussions that we have are the backbone of what we do here. So rounding it out like this has been really, really fun. So thanks for that.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the welcome back. Thanks for holding the fort. Thanks for the fun. It's great fun. I really enjoy it. Yeah, it's been great. It's lovely to be back. And yeah, it's been really nice to be welcomed back by listeners as well. Had some really lovely messages from people, which has been really nice. So yeah, I'm glad to be back, and I'm here for the next round. Let's do it.
Awesome. And thank you to everyone out there for your continued support. We really appreciate it. Let us know. I mean, please email us on cinematologists@gmail.com. I'm more on Instagram now than I am on Twitter, but you can catch me on both of those. You can get both of our work emails if anybody wants to get in touch. We've got a few episodes that are definitely going to run in the new season from September onwards. But if anybody out there has any ideas for collaborations, or indeed wants to be interviewed about amazing work that they've done, then tap us up. There may be a space there that we can fit you in, and especially if you've got an event that you want to run and you want to talk about us rocking up to and maybe covering. We like to do that, but we tend to get notices about that very late in the day, and we can't do it at like 1 or 2 weeks notice. Yeah, and there's a cost implication as well, so we need to discuss that. So we're very up for coming to people's gigs and festivals and all that kind of stuff, but we need prior notice to be able to do that. But thank you very much for everyone who continues to listen and enjoy the podcast.
Well said. With that in mind, let us bid adieu until the autumn, when we'll be back for season 18. But for now, this has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.